Once again, a very good evening to all of you. Welcome to this Zoom, local webinar event being organized by ISST, EQI, Youth India and Ladies in College Department of Development Communications. So this is an event on climate resilience through gender-focused evaluations. And our focus is on climate resilience through gender-focused evaluations, where we are talking about targeted gender-focused programs which have previously reduced poverty and improved social inclusion, but inequality and marginalization still remain a challenge. And with the climate change and the current situation, the risks are further exacerbated, impacting availability of food, water, livelihoods, health, etc. And women are found to be typically more vulnerable.
But also provide incentive.
I'll request all the participants to stay on mute. Um, in this specific webinar, we have three speakers with us, Dr. Janvi, Mr. Navesh and Ms. Neha. They are focusing on gender-focused evaluations of climate change programs with a gender lens, and evaluating poverty alleviation programs with climate change and gender context. I first want to talk a bit about the two main organizers of this event, Evaluation Community of India and ISST. Evaluation Community of India is India's national voluntary organization of professional evaluators and the professional umbrella organization for all M&D practitioners in the country. If you are not already a member, I request you to become a member with us. EQI provides a platform for sharing the knowledge, research outcomes, and best practices in the field of M&D for advocacy for furthering role of quality evaluations in enhancing development results and nurturing growth of evaluation capabilities. You can also visit our website equionline.in for further details. ISST, the other partner Institute of Social Studies Trust, conducts macro and micro research directed towards socio-economic empowerment of women, adolescents, and children. It has worked on social change focusing on livelihoods, well-being of vulnerable communities. It addresses gender dimensions of labor through critical public spirited inquiry and a gender lens. So I will first invite the first speaker for the day, Dr. Janvi Andaria. Janvi ji will be speaking about the gendered aspect to sorry I just lost my pages because tagging between pages. Sorry. Janvi ji has steered collaborative leadership at ISST since 2021. She has led projects on women farmers, home-based workers in South Asia, and delivered training programs. Her 30 plus years work intersects vulnerability, marginalization, collective empowerment, grassroots leadership, and capacity building. Janvi ji, I will request you to share your screen and start the first presentation. You are on mute, I think.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Yatin. And I also join him in extending a very warm welcome from Delhi and to people from other parts of the country and hopefully some other faces from the rest of the world. What we thought we will do today was that I would give a kind of a little bit of a background about what is when we talk about gender transformative evaluations, and then move into the experiences of projects and evaluations around climate change. So what I'm going to do is to just walk you through how we look at it and what we see is the basics of gender transformative evaluations. I hope my slides are visible.
Can you go full screen?
Yeah, I'll just move to the slideshow version. Yeah.
Yes.
So basically, when we speak about gender, what has happened is that unfortunately, a lot of people think that gender is about women. And although we've been talking about this for many, many decades now, but I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that gender is actually a conceptual category. And there is very often it is used also very loose that are you doing gender? Well, gender is a conceptual category and it needs to be either actually posted, either it's a gendered approach or it is gender equality or gender equity. In itself, gender, we put a lot of assume that there is a lot behind it. So I just wanted to kind of say that what it actually does is that it brings into focus the lived realities beyond the grammar, which was about, we always learned in English, you learned about gender as a thing in grammar. But the feminist movement, the critiques of the mainstream development paradigm have brought in new meanings to the term gender. And I think it's important to kind of remind ourselves of what it was, which is that it brings into focus lived realities. Earlier, yes, it was about men and women, but now we have further, sharpened our understanding, and what we call the cisgender people. But also, it includes individuals who identify themselves along the LGBTQI plus spectrum, and with a particular focus on marginalized communities. Now, I am bringing this thing about marginalized communities because that's a position I hold, that for me, gender is definitely about talking about those who have been left behind. And that's the kind of space from where we use the term gender in the term gender transformation. And the term transformation is definitely about change, but it is much more than that. And it is about really addressing largely invisible kind of factors or aspects of communities, such as changes in norms, changes in power, changes in the rules of the society, patriarchy, religion, race, caste, and whatever the basis could be for discrimination. It is about bringing about a shift in that. And transformation actually is also about a change that cannot really be undone. It's something that shifts for good. And until that happens, it may remain change that can be, that you can slide back to. You might have some gains and it can go back to something else. Or it can be changes in some aspects and not all. But when we say transformation, it's really something that shifts very significantly, and for at least something that can last for more than just 1 or 2 years, or it's something that can affect, there's a shift that happens. And so one has had large transformation, the digital transformation, for instance, or we have, environment week, for instance, we see that how, the understanding of what is a healthy planet and what we have done, there is something that very significantly has kind of shifted. And therefore, when we are talking about transformation, it is about something very significant. And yet, at the same time, it has this challenge that it is not something that you can see and call out very easily. So what we feel is that now there is a lot of acceptance that, okay, we tried with, we have looked at change along a kind of a continuum or a spectrum. And we definitely, when we began understanding gender and gender concepts, we realized that there were many practices which were actually gender negative, in the sense that they were harming the balance between men and women. Then you had some which could harm, but or those who are kind of non-responsive. They're those projects that don't really make any difference. It maintains the status quo. Then you had projects which were gender sensitive or gender, more recognizing that there is a difference between the way men and women, particularly of marginalized communities, respond differently to challenges, behave differently when certain opportunities come up. So you start becoming sensitive at least to it, but whether or not you're able to program it is something that comes when you're moving to a more gender specific, a gender intentional, or a gender targeted approach. And finally, you come to the stage. I don't know if you can see the top one. Is it because the floating? Oh, okay, at least now. So the last one is the gender transformative one, which is about, when we say you change fundamentally certain elements, and you challenge the basis on which all the inequalities are actually experienced. So this is actually now becoming more and more popular, in at least when you're designing programs for gender equality. But I wouldn't say that it has fully been understood. I see that a lot more language of gender transformation is now being used, because there is an understanding that whatever we have done till now in becoming gender sensitive or being targeted, the needle is not really shifting. And therefore, you need to speak about something more, and that's what we are calling transformation. So there is an acceptance, there is a recognition that we need to do something more, and programs are either able to do it or not able to do it. And that's what my other two co-panelists will be talking about. I just wanted to then move to the next thing about how do you make evaluations gender transformative, because here we are going to gLOCAL is all about evaluations, and we want to kind of say what do we mean by that. And here I'm drawing from what is part of one of the courses that we offer, that if we understand at the center, when we say transformation, that it is power, it's norms, it is resources, it's structures, then you need to think about all of this right from the time of designing the evaluations objectives. That what is the objective, and in the objective, how do we bring in these components? Defining the scope of the evaluation, how do you bring it in? Methodologically, how do you make it more transformative and addressing these? And in the report, the way the report is written, the language it is written, how it is shared, is also something that needs to be is part of what we would call a gender transformative evaluation. And let's quickly take some examples at what does it kind of look like. So again, these are some terms you will use, like gender instrumental would fall between maybe say gender negative and gender kind of non-responsive. Gender absent is definitely non-responsive. So these terms are also, I'm kind of using different terms in two different slides, because also want to talk about that there is so much of language, and we need to understand when we are applying it, what is it that we mean? Some of the times they overlap, some of the times they are different. So here I'm using a slightly different language, but if you go through it, you will realize that it's similar to the spectrum that I had spoken about. So when we speak about, if you examine the objectives of an evaluation, the objectives themselves can be plotted against this spectrum. So for instance, if the objective is only to assess results of, say, the instrumental use of women for other development goals, that, okay, women are very nimble at, doing something, and therefore they were involved in that component of a livelihood program, which required nimble fingers. And so therefore, nimble fingers were more important. Who has them? It is women. So you're not really entering it from the point of view of, women, but you're thinking about some skill or some ability or some attribute of women, which is important to meet a developmental goal, and therefore you have women. So when you're looking at it, that's a gender instrumental approach. A gender absent, of course, is that you assume that there are no gender differences, there are no gender issues, and we're talking about education for all, we're talking about health for all, and therefore we don't need to really look at any differences between, enrollment or health outcomes, which are different for men or women or people. Now, when we are using gender, we use it across cisgender as well as queer people, as well as those people who are marginalized. When we become gender targeted in our objective, that time you start looking at men, women, and other marginalized groups. So you start looking at in a more specific, targeted sort of a way. In a gender responsive objectives, what you would do is you would assess the results. Your language of the objectives would be such that it is expecting to assess results related to differentiated needs and benefits across gender and social identities. And when we talk about gender transformational evaluation objectives, it will have a language that seeks to assess changes in the deep-rooted gender social norms, power, resource distribution, policy, and legal structures. So it's right from the objectives that we start wanting to make it different. Looking at the scope, again, very quickly, whether it is instrumental, absent, or targeted, the scope will be fairly limited, normally, but not always, often defined by donors, evaluation team, implementing agency. The women themselves or the people for whom the project is design may or may not be even present in the evaluation team. Their voices may be used more as data points, but not recognizing their agency in any sort of a way. But when you move to a gender responsive scope, again, not always, but normally it is defined by all stakeholders, including men and women from marginalized communities. The evaluation team would also include women, not for a tick box, but women with influence on evaluation. Very often we have, now we say that, okay, the team should have somebody on gender. So you need, and then all the gender is just put on the woman expert, the gender expert. Not in that manner, but to make it more integral and with an intentionality to include the voice and an understanding the technical components of gender equality. And gender transformation, again, is defined by all stakeholders. But if the team also will include not just women, but women also from marginalized communities, and again, those who have an influence on the evaluation. The methodology, again, when you are in the first three categories, you will largely rely on quantitative methods, to some extent, maybe qualitative methods, and FGD or something. But at best, it is a gender targeted or a sex disaggregated perspective that, okay, let's have some figure out, okay, what's happening to men and women. So to some extent, that may be covered. But when you talk about being responsive, you are actually methodologically, you will definitely use mixed methods, because data is important, but so is the story behind the data. So is the context in which the project is implemented, the context in which the evaluation is being done. So understanding all of that becomes critical when you are being gender responsive. You make an effort to meet with marginalized women participants to bring that, okay, what did the project do specifically for those communities who tend to be left behind. And you will use gender analysis frameworks. There are several gender analysis frameworks which you will use to look at the outcomes of a project. And gender transformative, of course, all of the above, of gender responsive, but you would also use more gender transformative frameworks now, which will talk about power additionally. And you would, try and, be more bold. So if I may say, with the methods as well. So a lot of participatory tools are used, storytelling methods are used, which are unconventional in many ways, but they are very useful to bring out the voices of those who are typically not used to talking about themselves, their experiences, because historically, social norms, power equations tell them that they have to be silenced, tell them that they are not to be heard. So using methods that allow us to hear those stories, their experiences, is what would make these methodologies transformative. And finally, the evaluation report, in terms of how do you, you look at it. So maybe there is a disaggregation about gender, or maybe there is an instrumental analysis. Again, as we said, that the scope may be often defined by, the donors or the evaluator team themselves. So for them, this is about meeting the need for the evaluation of a certain, of largely maybe those who are in the design process. Of course, in the absent, there is no disaggregation there, when there is no gender, component in it. At least when you have a gender targeted approach, there is sex disaggregation, there is of data, of analysis, on targeting of inputs. So at least you will get some data, but you are still not getting the story in the to be missing. And when we are talking about gender responsive, there is an intersectional analysis of benefits and outcomes, a little bit of the why, a little bit of the story, some case studies here and there is what you would expect in this kind of a report. And when we are talking about a gender transformative evaluation report, there is an intersectional analysis of both benefits and outcomes. There is an assessment in changes in norms, in power, in distribution of resources, in the legal and the policy structures, whether or not the the objectives may maybe, or sometimes we often say that if you would make an effort to create a box or a little bit of a section that will talk about this if you are want to create an evaluation report that fits into what we would call a gender transformational approach to evaluation. So with that, I am going to kind of leave these thoughts with you, and I'm going to stop share to say that as we listen into the presentations of Nabesh and Neha, we'll try to see how these evaluations are able to address. Let me say right at the beginning that a gender transformational approach, whether in development or in evaluation, is like, according to me, reaching for the moon. It's not something that you can do very easily. It is not something that can happen with very quick applications of tools and manuals, because it is an approach, because it is an understanding, because it's a perspective. It takes time, it takes effort, but nevertheless, just as we have, say, RCTs as the gold standards in quantitative, kind of evaluations. Gender transformational evaluations, I would say, should be the gold standards when we are trying to look at achieving gender equality and what is the role that evaluations can play. So let's be, take a step back and look at evaluations and say that, okay, what have we been able to achieve and what still remains to be done? And I'm sure a lot still remains to be done, but there are frameworks, there is an ability, and I've just given you a glimpse of some of the ways in which we should be looking at it. Thank you so much. Back to you, Yatin.
Thank you, Janvi ji. Next, I'll invite Nabesh ji to speak. I'm deliberately not starting sharing my screen for just a few seconds. I'll just read out. So, Nabesh Mohidar has 25 years of experience as an implementer and researcher. He has 20 plus publications in health, HIV, migration, poverty reduction, and climate change. He has designed large development programs with a focus on inclusive governance and gender equity. He is associated with ORG Mark, AIMS Research, and CARE. So having after Janviji's discussion around what is gender focused evaluation, gender transformative evaluation, and all of that, Nabesh ji will bring in the climate change aspect of it, and will also share us examples of evaluation where his team has focused on the gender aspect while doing the evaluations. Nabesh ji, the stage is yours. Please share this screen. Yeah.
Thanks, Yatin. And good evening to everyone. Um, Extremely glad to be part of this conversation. Let me just share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, you can go full screen. Yes.
Right. So I'll be talking about climate change interventions and through gender equality, especially trying to bring about empowerment of women and resilience. Now, here, just to kind of um, get back from Dr. Janvi's presentation to a program. These are experiences from two programs that I was part of as implementer and as a mentor. And so these programs basically had strong conditional objectives in the sense that changing conditions related to climate change. We all know that how climate change has been impacting in the rural areas, farmers. And within that, these programs focused on enhancing climate resilience. One is in Gujarat and the other is in Chhattisgarh and Maharashtra. And these projects were designed to be gender transformative. So I'll just talk about a little bit here in terms of what were the strategic objectives. I'm not really paraphrasing the exact objectives that the projects had, but then yes, enhance sustainable income for women, smallholders, and landless workers, meaning through adoption of improved practices in agriculture and livestock. Um, Strengthen community-based institutions, which meant the SHGs and the cluster level federations to provide access to schemes, services, markets, and value chains. Improve alternate income opportunities, promoting micro enterprise activities linked to agriculture and dairy value chain, and promoting gender responsive ecosystem, which looked at influencing value chain actors, market institutions, service providers to support women. Um, Similarly, in Chhattisgarh and Maharashtra, we had again similarly promoting climate resilient livelihoods, strengthen agriculture productivity and sustainability, introduce climate smart practices tailored to local contexts, um, integrate climate risks into development planning in terms of a long-term, um, uh, process at the grassroots level, and supporting community-led adaptation plans. So community adaptation plans or CAPs were actually a cornerstone of the projects, which looked at understanding what women farmers in these communities understand by changing patterns in the climate, and for them what did it mean, and therefore what were the key challenges, and then working on that in terms of planning around it. Influence local and regional policies and practices. It did not aim to really kind of change policies at a macro level, but within the communities, panchayats, and gram sabhas, how it, we can kind of look at it. Um, and of course, empower women and marginalized groups, build leadership, literacy, economic agency, self-help groups, enhance participation, governance, and decision making. So these were some of the strategic objectives. The research areas. Now, what I'm going to talk about is essentially the endline evaluations. And therefore, the research areas broadly looked at impact on women, smallholder and landless workers. So what was the actual impact on the woman? And so that was the focus. Adoption of improved agriculture and livestock practices, um, assess community-based adaptation approaches. So in terms of the processes that were followed, um, are they leading to any changes? Are the processes itself robust? And then the leadership and management skills enhancement among women participants. Women's access to various services, including government and banking services. Um, Try and correlate, gender equality and poverty, whether there is any improvement, and finally, what are the sustainability of these outcomes. The methods that were used were pre and post assessment using mixed methods, quantitative and qualitative. Now, both these projects were similar but not same. Therefore, also the evaluations were similar but not the same. Broadly, household surveys were done using CAPI and Bobo Toolbox. Metrics such as crop yields, food security, adoption of climate change practices, and also in terms of certain women empowerment indicators. Similar, the qualitative approach really looked at participatory tools, um, focus groups, community adaptation plans, discussion in terms of whether these processes were working or not. And also capture community perspectives on rainfall variability and livelihoods, whether there's been any change, and it can be really looked at, any significance there. The study areas were Bharuch in Gujarat, Bagicha and Pathalgaon in Jashpur, Chhattisgarh, and Jalgaon in Maharashtra. If we look at the results, what it has led to is improved agricultural practices and productivity. 60% of farmers reported increased productivity, uh, widespread adoption of climate resilient practices, organic composting, vermiculture, intercropping, SRI. Practices were mostly low cost and accessible, increasing likelihood of sustained use. Now, the left-hand side results are from Chhattisgarh and the right ones are from Gujarat. These results that I'm talking about is from the women themselves. Now, initially in the project, of course, considering women as a farmer has difficulties in India, even though a lot of work is done by women in the farm. A woman being considered as a farmer is itself a issue that from there on, in the focus was on building the agency of the woman, and these responses were from themselves. Significant economic gains were observed. A 423% increase in annual household income between 2017 to 19. Diversified income through livestock, small businesses, and wage labor. SHG supported women enterprises, boosted women's income and agency. Progress on water access. Some improvement in water availability, but majority still experience days without water. So a little bit of the context. Chhattisgarh, the locations that the project worked in were majorly forested. However, even in those forested areas, um, because of erratic rainfall and erratic monsoon, um, there is a scarcity of water now being fed during the starting of the project and even now. Small scale rainwater harvesting had limited impact on chronic water scarcity. So what this meant is that the project was low cost and did not really look at utilizing ground-based water. Um, so, so, so based on the strategy here, there's a finding. Increased access to climate information. 80% of the respondents had improved access and understanding of weather and climate forecasts. Use of mobile phones enable timely agriculture decision making. Now here, use of mobile phones and SMS, the challenge for women was there, of course, in terms of accessing having the phones and in terms of the literacy. So literacy was part of the project somewhere in between. Women's empowerment and voice participation in Gram Sabhas rose from 70% to 85%. 91% of the women were confident that their concerns would be addressed publicly. Similarly, if we look at Gujarat, 28% increase in cotton and 30% in wheat productivity. 58% of farmers reported reduced pest attacks, etc. Farmers Fields Business School was a process adopted, and it really these sessions help improve adaptive capacities. Similarly, there was increases in livelihoods related to dairy and goatery. Government linkages, 66% is household access one or more government schemes. Total leverage benefit, because of the accessing of government schemes was approximately 93 lakhs across 1015 households. If we look at gender empowerment, um, 76% women reported improved support from women at home, 77% at community level, and 87% women had increased acceptance in financial decisions at home. So these were some of the key findings in terms of the success of these projects. If we look at the connections between women empowerment, resilience, and economic improvement, here also a lot of improvement has taken place. Women's participation. So there are number of, for example, participation in training, knowledge increase, and agriculture productivity, adoption of low-cost practices, and therefore reduced expenditures. Um, Improved access and understanding of climate information correlated with reduced input losses. Women's confidence in farming practices increased, supporting sustained adoption. Similarly, women's economic contributions through agriculture and small businesses increased household respect and decision-making power. So money through SHGs were utilized, and therefore that in many cases, in most cases, improved household respect as well. Income increases and also diversified income. Yeah. SHG membership was a key aspect. It's not membership really in terms of now here I think the projects also piggyback on a huge government policy and administrative boost in terms of supporting the SHGs. So one is linking those, and secondly, how does one utilize those resources once received? That is where the project really looked at. Shifting gender norms, also enhanced agriculture roles. Here, gender dialogues played a key role um, to give some of the examples here. Earlier, even if we women in a group or husbands would not allow that. Now, even if we get late during meetings, they don't say anything. Men in our house have started giving us more respect. Now we are savings, which we did not have earlier. Now the men also wash utensils and sweep floors. So what is not mentioned here, and which I have seen, is that I've seen some of the men in this particular village wash clothes and take the clothes out for hanging outside. So those are some of the major shifts in gendered behavior. So what are the kind of learnings and what we can kind of for discussion is while a number of indicators show adoption of new knowledge and practices leading to positive income, recovery from stress loss was low, in the sense that resilience, adaptive capacity was quite high as measured. Whether that is also resilience, so that in future there is able to bounce back quickly, is something that needs to be looked at. Um, Positive changes in terms of norm change was observed with regards to agency relations, and also at a um, at both within the house and outside. At a structural level, in terms of there was still more work to be done. At the household and community level, the gender dialogues were identified as
Beshi,
a
can we
success.
finish quickly?
Yeah, sure. And then, so inclusive governance and power analysis. This is a snapshot of the power analysis which was carried out. And then the there is a complexity of capturing women empowerment and resilience, and of course the attribution and contribution aspects of it, also the short term in terms of the short term projects. So, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Navesh. Now I request Neha to take the stage. I'll just introduce Neha while she is sharing her screen. So, Neha Dhingra is a gender and participatory research specialist with over 13 years of experience in M&D, program design and advocacy. She's a core member of GENSA and a TISALUM. She leads gender transformative evaluations and community-driven research, ensuring marginalized voices shape policies and development programs. Neha, please take over and start sharing your screen.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, can you go full screen? Slideshow mode.
Is it visible?
Yes.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I think I'm really excited to be here. And already, I think the session has been, opened by Janvi's remarks on how do we look at gender and how do we look at evaluations, and also by Navesh, who's tried to cover how, targeted interventions towards women and how you eventually assess them would lead to very specific, kind of improvements to the program. So I would just want to take a case of, say, ultra poor graduation approaches where, so basically how this program is different from, your regular uh, programs which are anti-poverty or poverty elevation programs. So ultra poor poverty elevation programs would largely look at, multi-dimensionally poor. And as per the Indian, even Niti Aayog has kind of put out, the multi-dimensionally poverty index. So these are all aspects which are usually looked at when we look at multidimensionally poor. So poverty in its definition has also evolved a lot over the last many decades. And we see that aspects of health, education, and standard of living, and all these aspects also, are comprised of when we looking at a poverty elevation program. So it's not only livelihoods, or it's not only health or education, but if we look at a household in entirety, look at their entire components of water, sanitation, electricity, assets, financial inclusion. So all these multiple aspects would what comprise of poverty. And so when we look at ultra poor, we look at historical vulnerabilities as well. So when we say that we want to, as maybe Navish has highlighted, that they worked with SHGs. So within the SHGs, if we are to look at people with historical vulnerabilities, we might find tribals or primitive tribal groups or even SC communities who would continue to be marginalized or outside the fold of the SHG movement. And then they also have social vulnerabilities, and therefore they are extremely poor. So when we look at extremely poor, we don't look at people who are only financially poor but are also not do not have the kind of social capital or the cultural capital, apart from the economic. And so we need to look at all these aspects when we look at programming or working with ultra poor. So I've just tried to share what a graduation approach would look like. Now, there are several different kinds of graduation approaches, which have existed. And, it typically consists of, some assets and some assets which are planned specifically for the poorest household, which would be working with. And then it looks at, provision of basic needs. This would largely come as, support which you can leverage through government services, and, convergences with different departments of already existing schemes that you want to, make sure that the target population gets access to. And then it looks at coaching. So Many of the UPP programs would include at least the A and B aspects, the asset and basic needs aspects. And then you can also, coaching is also something that is usually accompanying, but not all poverty, ultra poor graduation programs have had a component of coaching, and there are all different kind of studies that highlight different approaches that have been taken by organizations. For a lot of these approaches, we see that since it's a very short time bound, inputs that are given or worked on with the family or the household, we do see that within the short period of time when the program is initiated, there is, large shifts in terms of their basic needs are met, the livelihoods, say, which were not currently where the livelihood scope will be very limited. There would be an addition of, say, one or two livelihood income streams, or diversification of livelihood, where you look at one farm or maybe one non-farm, or within farm we look at two different aspects. So livelihoods are diversified, and then say financial inclusion and social empowerment. So this is how most of the graduation programs look at, like a very structured programs with like 2 years of intense hand holding, and then we look at a larger impact which we think should happen given the programming that has got. So a little about say what we wanted to cover as part of this webinar was that this is the approach that has been adopted for graduation programs, and then we look at livelihoods and how integral they are for poverty elevation, apart from provision of basic needs and financial inclusion. We also understand that livelihoods are the cornerstone for bringing people out of poverty, in the material sense at least. So now that we know that there are so many populations that are threatened by climate change, I wanted to narrow down on say a particular population that we are working with, which are primitive and vulnerable tribes. So I'll just quickly share what are the kind of observations that we have seen, and how does then the program need to look at aspects of gender and climate to and how do livelihoods then need to be thought through. So in terms of climate disruptions, we see that in PVTG habitations, we see that NTFP yields have been reducing over years, and there have been drastic reduction in dependency in terms of NTFPs, either because of laws that exist in the country, or because of issues of access, or because of climate change itself. And then there is also reduction in the yield of regular crops. So we also see more droughts, we also see more disasters, or like climate issues which address, which affect the yields. And then subsequently, we also see that there's, high migration to cities and towns. And then also there's a lot of disconnect of the younger generation from the forest. So traditionally, whatever livelihoods that were there, we might need to revisit or unpack these and see how they would then translate for a much younger generation. And then there are also these are very, very generic trends which I have shared here, and then there are also high out of pocket expenses that are there on health. And then yeah so then we need to really see that like traditionally we've always thought that this group, like vulnerable tribal groups, who are like form like high populations in many parts of the country, we've always thought them through a lens of forest rights and access to NTFP and how do we process. But like very recently in my conversations with one of the people who worked extensively on livelihoods, they say that the dependency or the on forests is reducing because the forest produce itself is reducing. So we really need to think of these traditional livelihood models and think them through a climate resilience and a gender equity lens. So how are these intertwined? So as Janvi had shared earlier, that our programs actually need to be centered themselves on a perspective of at least gender sensitive to gender transformative kind of a spectrum, where we understand and are willing to acknowledge at least that our uh, populations that we're working with, they've undergoing stress and strain because of climate change. So there is particular vulnerability because of climate, because of forest produce reduction, because of agricultural produce reducing. And then there is also gendered access to resources and decision making. So we do know that in a lot of places that women don't have access to resources and decision making within the household. They don't have access to markets, they don't have access to networks which will which they can leverage or use. And then there is also economic marginalization. So we see that these three kind of come together and create more vulnerable more challenges for women who are part of our communities. And then we are to also understand that climate stress also increases women's responsibility of cooking, cleaning, and care. So, we do know that this creates stress in terms of their time. So, they might have to walk longer. There might be less firewood available. There'll be no water available. And then we know that many habitations are very far off, so there's no childcare available. And then much of the livelihoods don't often account for women's mobility and unpaid work. We know that women are responsible for elderly care, child care, and their mobility is restricted to probably, maybe 2 kilometers or max 2 to 3 kilometers that they can, make themselves available, or they can't attend so many meetings, or, so there are all these factors that one has to factor in while planning any livelihood activity. We cannot take our beneficiaries outside of their context and reimagine something that is absolutely not viable for them. And then the other thing also is that many of the programs, they might not really value indigenous knowledge or experiences or existing climate adaptation strategies that might be existing but need to be then dug deeper and then scaled. So one has to keep your eyes and ears really open, I think, as practitioners and as evaluators. So this is the kind of approach that we think that should be adopted. And then the evaluation questions should also change. We need to look at how are the livelihood plans adapting to environmental change, and a lot of our graduation indicators look like livelihoods, financial inclusion. But then within livelihoods, the evaluation, we need to look at like how are they adapting to climate change, how are they looking at gender needs separately for men and women, like what Nobesh had mentioned, that women themselves are not thought as farmers. And like within the scope that I mentioned, within the limitations that we have working with women, how do we understand their differential needs and livelihood plans then actually respond to their needs? And then are climate risk considered in asset selection? So if the area is flood prone, how much of dairy can we do? And then for everything, the answer in many of the plans is that we'll do goats, we can give goats. I mean, but then is that a solution that the community actually wants to have, or are there any other solutions that can be thought through? So the livelihood planning should take into account all the factors which I discussed, and then also look at traditional ecological, gender knowledge systems that are existing, like say women. There are also a lot of seed banks and traditional systems that exist, which must be encouraged and explored if we are to rethink designing as well as evaluation. And then how are strategic gender needs being prioritized? So not only look at immediate gains out of livelihoods interventions, but then also look at like how does the design push for more strategic gender needs, like how does it look at gender norm change, and can the program actually look at a more socio-ecological or that kind of a perspective where you move from the individual to the household and then society and then also state. So how are we looking at the various levels as part of the program, and what are long shifts that we are looking at? And then lastly, if we would look at a gender, if we would look at deepening the evaluation lens, I would say that we need to look at issues of power at the center, because we must understand that these populations who are marginalized or are in a position have existed in a particular way because of a lot of politics of marginalization. We cannot, as part of the evaluation, not detach our beneficiaries from the system that they're embedded in. We must look at and understand and also equally engage. We must understand the system they're embedded in and how do we operationalize the, various levers in which, we want to input some activities so that, there can be some changes in their, how they engage with various actors at the system level. And also look at empowerment from a gender transformative perspective, which would mean from looking the entire problem from a systemic level and not limiting ourselves only to immediate program outputs, which are also very equally important to capture, but like the larger questions would also continue to should also continue to be addressed. So this is largely what I wanted to cover. Thank you.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you to all the three speakers today for talking about gender focused, gender transformative evaluations, climate change, and all the other aspects. So, since you are almost out of time, there's just one question for you, Neha, in the chat. There have been no more questions till now. So, Catherine asked that bank account was added to OPHI's MPI. Was it added? And then she asked, how do you use this information and analyze it with the MPI, multidimensional poverty index? So, any thoughts on that, Neha?
Just give me a second. So, I mean, I just feel that bank accounts and access to financial inclusion is amongst the most important aspects that one has to look at, while we look at poverty. And even if we see that with a lot of populations or like groups that we work with, we see that even though they have bank accounts, they are not active, or many of them continue to not have any identity papers for which bank account can be opened. So definitely this is one very basic yet important component that would help in understanding how one would understand poverty.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, do I have any
If I
thoughts
may,
on this?
if I
Yeah,
may just also
yeah,
jump
yeah.
into that response, Yatin. I am having some problem with my camera. See, the other than this financial inclusion, I think what is important is that a woman, if a bank account has to be opened in her name, will need to go to a bank. There the bank is likely to ask her, okay, what are the documents, what is your name, so it is a formal institution in which a woman's name is kind of recorded, and it kind of starts getting aggregated into your national aggregation of data. So this was also a goal for India, of financial inclusion of the poor and particularly of women. So in India we also have a scheme where you women are allowed to open a zero bank balance bank accounts. So these were also ways by which the system is trying to encourage also the families to open bank accounts for women. And that's the first step. Of course, you can say that, even if they have accounts, the men will be handling it. Yes, that happens. But it also allows for women to know that, okay, if I have a bank account, I need to know what is the amount there, where, what is happening to the money. So it's like a basic step that helps you to move towards, say, acknowledgement, being specific, targeted, and then move on to asking more questions or challenging and then demanding in that pathway. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Janvi. So I'd like to take this moment to thank all the three speakers, Dr. Janvi, Navesh, and Neha, and all the participants. And just before we end the meeting, I want to remind you all that the EvalFest 2026 is coming up next year in February. So please keep this time saved to attend the event in Delhi. And we are also looking for partners, panelists, speakers, paper presenters, and all different capacities, even volunteers. So if you are interested, please reach out to us at Evaluation Committee of India, and we'll take it forward. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. I will close the event now. Thank you.
Thank you, Yatin. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thanks,
Neha.
Yatya.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nabesh.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.